Case 1. The vanishing of Brandon Swanson. It was just after midnight on a spring evening in 2008. The sky above the flatlands of western Minnesota hung dark and silent, pinpricked by faint stars and lit occasionally by the blinking of faraway aircraft. The land out here is vast, quiet, a patchwork of empty roads, wide fields, and sleepy little towns that seem to disappear when the sun goes down. Brandon Swanson was 19 years old that night, a smart, observant young man with a dry wit and a steady sense of self. He had just finished classes at a community college and had been celebrating with friends in Canby, a small town not far from where he lived. Nothing unusual, just some end-of-term gathering, a final goodnight to the school year. When Brandon left the party, he was calm and sober. He got into his green Chevrolet Lumina and headed off down Highway 68, a stretch of rural road that cuts through the dark like a ribbon of pavement. He was driving home to Marshall, Minnesota, a route he'd driven many times before, but something strange happened along the way. Around 1:54 a.m., Brandon called his parents. He said he had driven into a ditch. Nothing dramatic, no crash, just that his car was stuck and he couldn't get it out. He wasn't hurt. He was just a little annoyed. He told them he was near the town of Lind, about 7 miles from home. His parents, Brian and Annette, got in the car and drove out immediately to pick him up. Brandon stayed on the phone with them, chatting easily as they both tried to coordinate their positions. But something wasn't right. They drove up and down the gravel roads near Lind, but Brandon wasn't there. He told them he could see lights in the distance, maybe from Lind itself, and he'd start walking toward them. They kept him on the phone, trying to figure out where he might be. They stayed connected for nearly 47 minutes. In that time, Brandon never sounded panicked. He just kept walking, updating them on what he was seeing. A fence line, a gravel path, maybe a stream. He thought he was walking toward town. They reassured him they were close. Then abruptly he said, "Oh shit," and the line went dead. It was the last thing Brandon Swanson ever said. His parents tried calling back again and again. The phone rang, but there was no answer. For the next several hours they drove and searched, retraced the route, called the sheriff. They had no idea where he had gone. At first light, the search began in earnest. Police traced the last call to a cell tower near Taunton, about 25 miles northwest of where Brandon had said he was. This alone was strange. It suggested he'd been much farther away than anyone thought. Eventually, they found his car, not near Lind, but near Taunton, off a gravel road by a field. The car was intact, no sign of a crash, no sign of Brandon. No footprints led away from the car. No one in the area reported seeing or hearing anything. Dogs were brought in, and one bloodhound followed a scent through fields, down into a ditch, along a gravel road and toward an abandoned farmstead. Then, abruptly, the trail stopped, as if he had simply vanished from the land itself. The area was searched again and again. Fields, creeks, woods, abandoned structures. Searchers walked shoulder to shoulder. Helicopters scanned from above. Divers combed the Yellow Medicine River. No body, no clothing, no signs of distress. What makes Brandon's case so chilling is its quietness, the complete lack of struggle or explanation. He simply disappeared while on the phone with people who loved him, walking through the wide, flat silence of Minnesota farmland. There have been theories, of course. Some believe he fell into a river and drowned, though no remains have ever surfaced, and the area where he vanished isn't especially dangerous. Others suggest disorientation, that he was in shock, walking farther into isolation. A few raise darker possibilities, that someone encountered him on those roads, someone he didn't see coming. But there is no evidence, no certainty, just a final call, a moment of confusion, and a silence that never lifted. Every spring on the anniversary of his disappearance, Brandon's parents leave a porch light on. They say it will stay on until he comes home. Ambient, wind growing still, faint echo of footsteps fading into the fields. Now another quiet story emerges from the shadows. Case 2. The bizarre disappearance of the Sodder children. It was Christmas Eve, 1945, in the small town of Fayetteville, West Virginia. The town was tucked into the Appalachian Hills, where snow gathered thick and silent on the rooftops, and wood smoke curled slowly into the black December sky. Inside the Sodder home, the air was warm with celebration. George and Jenny Sodder had 10 children, and that night most of them were gathered together, laughing, eating, exchanging small gifts. The war had just ended. Spirits were high. The children were excited. By midnight, most of the family had gone to bed. 5 of the children, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny and Betty, remained downstairs, still playing with their toys. Jenny, the mother, let them stay up a little longer. Around 12:30 a.m., she was awakened by a phone call from a woman she didn't know, asking for someone Jenny had never heard of. She could hear strange laughter in the background. The call ended. Odd, but not alarming. An hour later, Jenny was awake again, this time by a sound on the roof. A soft thump, then a rolling noise. Moments passed, then smoke, then fire. By the time George and Jenny realized what was happening, the house was already burning fast. They called out to the children upstairs and scrambled to get as many out as they could. In the chaos, 4 of their children escaped. But the 5 who had stayed up late, they were never seen again. The fire gutted the house within hours. Firefighters didn't arrive until morning. By then, the home was a smouldering ruin. But even in the ashes, no trace of the 5 children was found. No bones, no remains, nothing. Officials declared them dead from the fire. But George and Jenny refused to believe it. And they had their reasons. The telephone wire to the house had been cut, not damaged by fire, but severed deliberately. A ladder that always rested against the side of the house was missing, later found at the bottom of a nearby embankment. A witness claimed to have seen someone throwing balls of fire at the house before the blaze. Another said they saw the children being loaded into a car and driven away. More reports came in, strange and scattered. Sightings of the children in Charleston, in Florida, even in a convent in St. Louis. A woman claimed she saw 4 of the Sodder children in a hotel a week after the fire, accompanied by 2 men and 2 women of Italian appearance. But nothing ever came of it. George and Jenny became obsessed with finding the truth. They erected a billboard near their property with the faces of the missing children and the question, what was their fate? They hired private investigators. They dug through government records. They believed firmly that their children had been kidnapped. Some suggested the Sodders were targeted because George had been outspoken against Mussolini. The Sodders were originally from Italy, and George had made political enemies. The war had left scars. There were whispers, but no proof. The FBI looked briefly into the case, but closed it due to lack of evidence. The local police insisted the children had died in the fire. But if they had, why was there nothing left of them? Even in house fires, bones are almost always found. The Sodder parents died without answers. To this day, the mystery remains. No bodies were ever recovered. No graves. No confirmed sightings. Just an empty house, a ruined Christmas, and a family forever haunted by the possibility that their children might have lived. Somewhere. Somehow. Ambient, a wind in the pine needles, soft footsteps in snow, far-off church bells chiming. The next case takes us deeper into the unknown. Case 3. The Man from Torrid. In the heat of a Tokyo summer in 1954, the terminal of Haneda Airport buzzed with travelers, the air filled with a low murmur of foreign tongues and the rhythmic clatter of luggage wheels. Customs officers stood beneath large ceiling fans that barely stirred the heavy air. Planes landed in the background like slow birds, and everything moved at the measured pace of a post-war world still finding its rhythm. Among the arriving passengers on that unremarkable day was a man in a neatly pressed suit, holding a European-style passport. He appeared calm, professional, perhaps a businessman, perhaps a diplomat. When he approached the customs desk, he presented his documents and explained in fluent French and then Japanese that he was from a country called Torrid. The customs officer blinked. Torrid? "Yes," the man said, his tone matter-of-fact. "It's between France and Spain. I've been here before." But there was no Torrid on any map. At first, the officers assumed he had meant Andorra or had mispronounced some other place, but his passport clearly read Torrid. It looked entirely legitimate. Stamps, visas, official seals. The man carried currency from multiple European countries and even had a driver's license issued in Torrid, with supporting documents from a matching company, one that, to the Japanese officials' knowledge, did not exist. Politely but firmly, they escorted him to a small interrogation room. The man was confused but cooperative. He said he had been doing business in Japan for several years, and this was simply a routine trip. He pointed out where his company was located in Tokyo, even marked it on a map. But the building he indicated housed an entirely different firm, one that had never heard of him. They called the company. No records. They called the hotel he claimed to have a reservation at. They had no booking under his name. The bank he said he worked with didn't exist. And when they tried to cross-reference his passport with immigration records, nothing matched. Not the number, not the issuing country. Hours passed. The man grew increasingly agitated, insisting that this had never happened before, that something was wrong, that he had come through customs in Japan many times, that his company would vouch for him, that Torrid was a real country, but no one had heard of it. It did not exist. Eventually, the officials placed the man in a guarded hotel room overnight, with 2 immigration officers posted outside the door. His documents were kept in a secure office at the airport. They intended to investigate further in the morning. But by morning, the man from Torrid was gone, vanished. There was no sign of a break-in, no tampering with the door. The officers outside swore they had not seen or heard a thing all night. The man's belongings, his clothes, his briefcase, had disappeared as well. Even stranger, when authorities returned to inspect his passport and paperwork, those too were missing from the locked airport office. Nothing remained, no evidence, no trace. Some say it was a hoax, though no one ever came forward. Others suggest it was a case of psychological delusion, a man confused, perhaps mentally unwell. But skeptics point out the matching paperwork, the language fluency, the self-consistent story, and the fact that he simply vanished. There are those who believe he came from a parallel dimension, that in some version of the world a country called Torrid does exist, and for a moment the barrier between realities grew thin, that he stepped through by accident and slipped back again, unnoticed. And so the man from Torrid remains a whisper, a quiet footnote in the strange ledger of the unexplained, recorded by customs officers who were never able to prove what they saw or forget what they witnessed. Distant airport announcement in Japanese, soft rolling wheels, a pause of static. Another strange tale drifts forward now. Case 4, the Flannan Isles Lighthouse Mystery. The Flannan Isles are a cluster of rocky outcrops off the western coast of Scotland, remote, wind-beaten and shrouded in perpetual mist. They rise sharply from the North Atlantic, jagged and silent, often cloaked in fog. Few people ever go there, and fewer still stay for long. In December of 1900, 3 lighthouse keepers, Thomas Marshall, James Ducat and Donald MacArthur, were stationed on the largest of these isles, Eilean Moor. Their job was simple, but vital. Keep the light burning, guide the ship safely, and record each day's weather and activity in the logbook. The lighthouse had only been operational for about a year. Everything seemed in order. But then, something changed. On December 15th, a passing steamer, the Archtor, noted that the light was not operating. Unusual, but not necessarily alarming. Storms often interfered. Still, it was logged. Then days passed. No communication came from the island. When the relief vessel, the Hesperus, finally reached the lighthouse on December 26th, delayed by violent storms, the crew immediately sensed that something was wrong. No one came to greet them. The lighthouse stood silent, its lamp dark. As they stepped ashore, they found signs of recent damage to the west landing. Twisted metal railings, displaced rocks, ropes tangled like seaweed. but no sign of the men. Inside the lighthouse, the scene was strangely intact. The clock had stopped. The beds were unmade. Plates of food remained untouched. A single chair was overturned. One oilskin coat was still hanging on its peg. The other two were gone. The final logbook entries were unsettling. December 12th, severe winds, the likes of which I have never seen before in 20 years. Ducat is quiet. MacArthur is crying. MacArthur, the most seasoned of them, known to be tough and emotionally steady. What could have made him weep? December 13th, storm still raging, as if from the heavens themselves, all three of us praying. December 14th, nothing. Silence. But according to weather records from the mainland, no storms had been reported during that time. The skies had been calm. So what happened? Official investigation concluded that the men had likely been swept out to sea by a rogue wave, perhaps while trying to secure equipment near the West Landing. It was a practical explanation, but it left many unconvinced. Why had one man gone outside without his coat? Why were there no signs of panic or distress inside? Why would all three leave the safety of the tower during a storm, if there even was a storm? Some believe they were victims of something stranger. A freak wave, yes, but perhaps one so large it reached up the cliffside and pulled them off like toys. Others wonder if isolation drove one of them mad, resulting in a struggle, a fight, a fall. But there was no blood, no marks, no bodies. Others whisper of something older, something folkloric. The Flannan Isles have long been a place of legend. Locals speak of spirits, of ancient presences, of disappearances going back centuries. Shepherds once refused to bring their flocks to the islands, fearing the little people said to inhabit the hills. Whatever the truth, the three men were never seen again. Their names are still recorded in the lighthouse logbooks. Their absence still hangs in the salt air, and the light, the cold white light, still turns silently in the mist. Now we drift toward another quiet puzzle, waiting in the dark. Case 5. The Circleville letters, ambient, rustling paper, faint ticking clock, a low hum like distant static. In the quiet town of Circleville, Ohio, a place of picket fences, sleepy streets, and long-held secrets, something began in 1976 that would unsettle its residents for decades. It started with letters. Anonymous, handwritten letters began to arrive at homes, businesses, and schools. The messages were scrawled in blocky, deliberate print, and they contained deeply personal information, things no one else should have known. Affairs, financial troubles, private conversations. The letters accused, the letters threatened, and most disturbingly, the letters were right. Hundreds of them arrived over the years, sent to different people all across the small community. Most were postmarked from Columbus, but none contained a return address. The author seemed to know everything: where people worked, where they lived, what cars they drove, what time they left home. It was as if someone was always watching. At the center of the early storm was Mary Gillespie, a school bus driver. She began receiving letters accusing her of having an affair with the school superintendent. The writer demanded she stop, or else her secrets would be exposed. Her husband Ron also received a letter, and not long after, he was dead. Ron Gillespie died in what was officially ruled a car accident. He'd received a phone call just before the crash, and left the house in a fury. His truck veered off the road and struck a tree. But locals noticed strange inconsistencies. There were no skid marks. Ron had been a careful driver. Some said he'd been shot. Others said his brakes were tampered with, but no gunshot was officially recorded, no foul play confirmed, and the letters kept coming. In 1983, Mary was driving her school bus route when she spotted something odd. A sign on the side of the road with a crude message about her daughter. She stopped the bus, got out and attempted to remove it, but the sign was booby-trapped. Behind it, rigged to a box, was a small pistol, loaded and ready to fire. The trigger was tied to a string. Police examined the weapon and traced its serial number. It had once belonged to Paul Freshour, Mary's former brother-in-law. Paul insisted he'd been framed, but authorities believed they had their man. He was arrested and convicted of attempted murder, based largely on circumstantial evidence. He went to prison. But even while he was locked up, the letters continued. Dozens of them. Some were even sent to Paul himself. He was eventually released from prison. He maintained his innocence until his death, and though many suspected him, others remained convinced the real writer had never been caught. To this day, the identity of the Circleville letter writer remains unknown. A handwriting analysis failed to link the letters definitively to Paul. Polygraphs were inconclusive, and no fingerprints were ever found. Just ink and fear and the ever-growing silence between the lines. Some believe it was one person. Others believe it was a network, perhaps a group using the letters as a twisted form of vigilante justice. Or maybe it was something simpler and stranger. A person who watched, who waited, who knew too much and spoke through the mail. Circleville still remembers. Some residents still refuse to speak of it, and somewhere the words may still be written. Case 6. The disappearance of Frederick Valentich. It was October 21st, 1978. The air over the Bass Strait, a stretch of ocean separating mainland Australia from Tasmania, was unusually calm. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and darkness had taken its place, soft, endless, and deep. At 6:19 p.m., a young pilot named Frederick Valentich took off from Moorabbin Airport near Melbourne. He was flying a single-engine Cessna 182L. The purpose of the flight: a short, routine trip to King Island, just under 150 miles away. Frederick was 20 years old, clean-cut, respectful. A student pilot with a modest number of logged flight hours, he had no known history of trouble. And though he wasn't especially experienced, he was careful, methodical in his procedures and confident in his abilities. As the minutes passed, Frederick flew southward into the evening sky, tracking along the coast. At first, all was normal. But at 7:06 p.m., something strange happened. Frederick radioed Melbourne Air Traffic Control. He asked, "Is there any known traffic below 5,000? The response, "No known traffic." Frederick hesitated, then added, seems to be a large aircraft below 5,000. The controller asked him to clarify. Frederick responded that the object was moving quickly and had just passed about 1,000 feet overhead. He sounded calm, but uncertain. Seconds later, he added, "It's got a green light and sort of metallic. It's all shiny on the outside." There was no official radar contact on the object. Frederick continued narrating what he saw, his voice growing more tense. He reported the strange craft hovering, orbiting above him, even mimicking his own movements. He said it wasn't a plane. It wasn't like anything he'd seen before. Then he said something chilling. "It's not an aircraft." Moments later, Frederick said his engine was roughing out, sputtering, malfunctioning. When asked again to identify the object, he replied with a final strange line. "That strange aircraft is hovering on top of me again. It's hovering, and it's not an aircraft." Then silence. For the next 17 seconds, only open radio static was heard, a metallic, rhythmic clicking sound that no one could identify. After that, the line went dead. Frederick Valentich was never heard from again. Despite a massive search operation involving aircraft and naval vessels, no trace of Frederick or his Cessna was ever found. No wreckage, no clothing, no evidence of a crash. To this day, the disappearance of Frederick Valentich remains one of Australia's most baffling aviation mysteries. Theories range from the mundane to the fantastical. Some suggest he became disoriented, possibly flying upside down, mistaking lights on the water for an unidentified craft. But experts doubt this, citing his training and the conditions at the time. Others believe he may have staged his own disappearance. But why? He had no reason to flee. He left no note. He had no history of trouble, and nothing about his flight suggested he was planning to vanish. And then there are those who believe he encountered something beyond explanation, an unknown object in the sky that night. Something not from here. Whatever the truth, Frederick Valentich left behind only his voice, drifting into static over the sea. Case 7. The Bennington Triangle disappearances. The green mountains of Vermont roll silently under blankets of mist and pine. In their western foothills lies the Glastonbury wilderness, remote, forested, and unsettled. This region, surrounding the now abandoned town of Glastonbury, is known by another name among locals and folklore lovers alike, the Bennington Triangle. Between 1945 and 1950, a series of disappearances occurred in this region, each more baffling than the last. The land itself seemed to hold secrets, and those who stepped too far into the quiet woods sometimes did not return. The first to vanish was Middy Rivers. It was November 12th, 1945. Middy was 74 years old, but strong and spry. He worked as a hunting and fishing guide and knew the terrain better than most. That day, he was leading a group of 4 hunters near Hell Hollow, a foreboding name for a rugged patch of wilderness. At some point during the trip, Middy moved slightly ahead of the group. He was never seen again. The men behind him had only looked away for a moment. Search teams scoured the hills for days. They found no blood, no torn clothing, no signs of a struggle, just a single rifle cartridge in a stream, possibly dropped by Middy himself. Locals chalked it up to age or perhaps a misstep. But that theory wouldn't hold for long. 1 year later, another disappearance would haunt the region. On December 1st, 1946, 18-year-old Paula Weldon, a student at Bennington College, decided to take a walk on the Long Trail, a well-known hiking path that winds through the very heart of the wilderness. She wore a red parka. Witnesses saw her start the hike. She was alone, calm, not worried, but Paula never returned. When she failed to show up for class the next day, a massive search was launched. Students, faculty, police, and even the FBI joined in. They brought dogs, planes, hundreds of volunteers. No trace of her was ever found. The trail where she vanished was well marked and well used, but it seemed, somehow, to have swallowed her whole. By now, people were whispering. They talked about the land being cursed, about strange lights in the woods, about whispers on the wind. The Abenaki, the indigenous people of the region, had long believed the area was spiritually dangerous, a place the earth itself did not wish to be disturbed. 3 years passed before the next incident. In December of 1949, James Tedford, a veteran and resident of the Bennington Soldiers' Home, boarded a bus bound for Bennington after visiting relatives. Witnesses saw him get on. He was still on the bus at the last stop before Bennington. But when the bus arrived, James was gone. His luggage remained. His bus ticket was untouched. No one had seen him leave the vehicle. He had simply vanished, somewhere between one stop and the next. It was as if he had been plucked from reality itself. In 1950, things turned even darker. On October 12th, 8-year-old Paul Jepson disappeared while playing near his family's truck. His mother, who had only turned her back for a few minutes, could not find him when she returned. The boy was wearing a bright red jacket. He should have been easy to spot. Bloodhounds traced his scent to a nearby crossroads, one that eerily mirrored the location where Paula Weldon had vanished 4 years earlier. The scent trail ended cold. That same year, a final disappearance completed the strange sequence. On October 28th, Frida Langer, an experienced hiker, was walking with her cousin near Somerset Reservoir. She slipped, got wet, and said she would head back to camp to change clothes. She never arrived. But unlike the others, Frida's body was found. 7 months later, in a clearing that had already been searched extensively, her remains appeared. The body was too decomposed to determine a cause of death. 5 disappearances, 1 confirmed death, and not a single solid clue. The Bennington Triangle has since become a part of local legend, a name used to describe the area where these vanishings occurred. No one knows if the cases are connected. There was no pattern among the victims. Different ages, different backgrounds, different circumstances. And yet all were last seen within the same shadowed stretch of woods. Some blame the terrain, sudden sinkholes, treacherous slopes, wild animals. Others believe in more unearthly causes, rifts in time, energy vortices, hidden caves, or unknown forces of nature. Whatever the truth may be, The Bennington Triangle remains one of the most quietly disturbing mysteries in American folklore, and the woods are still there, silent, watchful, and waiting. Case 8. The Vanishing of Brandon Swanson. On the night of May 14, 2008, the air in rural Minnesota was crisp and quiet. Fields stretched out in every direction, flat, dark, and empty, with only the occasional distant barn light dotting the horizon. At the edge of that silence, a young man named Brandon Swanson was driving home. He was 19 years old. Bright, level-headed. He'd just finished his first year of college and was celebrating the end of the semester with friends. That evening, he left a party in Canby, Minnesota, and headed toward his hometown of Marshall, about 30 miles away. Sometime around midnight, Brandon's car veered off the road and into a shallow ditch. The car wasn't damaged, and he wasn't hurt, but he couldn't get the vehicle to move. He called his parents for help. He told them he believed he was near the town of Lind, just a short drive from their home. His parents got in their truck and drove out to find him. They flashed their lights, honked their horn, and searched the area he described. But there was no sign of Brandon or his car. They stayed on the phone with him. He insisted he could see the lights of Lind in the distance and said he'd start walking toward them. His father drove up and down nearby roads, looking. Still nothing. Brandon eventually grew frustrated and told his father he'd walk toward a nearby location where they could meet. He sounded calm, annoyed maybe, but not panicked. Then at 2:30 a.m., after nearly 47 minutes on the phone, Brandon suddenly shouted, "Oh, expletive!" And the line went silent. No noise, no wind, no struggle, just an abrupt end to the conversation. He never answered his phone again. When the sun rose, Brandon's parents contacted police. At first, authorities didn't take the case seriously. Brandon was a legal adult. Maybe he'd run off. Maybe he was sleeping it off somewhere. But as hours passed, it became clear something was very wrong. His car was finally located, not near Lind as he had believed, but over 20 miles away, near the town of Taunton. Investigators determined Brandon had been disoriented, possibly confusing one set of rural landmarks for another. This explained why his parents couldn't find him that night, but it deepened the mystery. Search teams combed the area for weeks. They found his footprints, tracked with dogs, which led away from the vehicle and into fields. The tracks eventually reached the Yellow Medicine River, a shallow but fast-moving stream. Searchers believed Brandon may have fallen into the water, but they found no evidence of a drowning. No body, no clothes, nothing. His scent picked up again on the other side of the river, indicating he may have crossed it, wet and cold, but still walking. And then the trail vanished. To this day, Brandon Swanson has never been found. No activity on his phone, no use of his bank account, no confirmed sightings. He had no known enemies, no signs of suicidal intent, and no reason to vanish. The area around Taunton is wide open, flat, sparse. It doesn't hide secrets easily, and yet it kept Brandon's fate concealed. His case remains one of the most baffling missing persons investigations in the region's history. Over the years, theories have multiplied. Some believe he succumbed to the elements, hypothermia perhaps, or an accident in the dark. Others suggest he may have been picked up by someone, voluntarily or otherwise, but no evidence has surfaced to support any one idea. In response to their son's disappearance, Brandon's parents advocated for legislation to improve law enforcement's response time to adult missing persons cases. Brandon's law was passed in Minnesota in 2009. Still, the question remains. What happened in the final moments before Brandon's last words? Why did he shout out? And how could a young man vanish so completely in a landscape so open, so flat, so quiet? Some mysteries whisper. Others scream once, then disappear into the dark. Brandon's voice was heard, and then it was gone. Case 9. The Mystery of the Sodder Children. It was Christmas Eve, 1945, in Fayetteville, West Virginia. The town was quiet, the hills blanketed in snow, and the Sodder family house glowed with warm light and festive laughter. George and Jenny Sodder lived there with 9 of their 10 children. One son was away in the military, but the rest were home, excited for the holiday. The evening passed peacefully. The younger children played with toys and stayed up late. Around 10 p.m., Jenny told them it was time for bed. Most went upstairs, while a few stayed awake to play longer. The house was large, with a coal-fired heater and a wooden frame. George and Jenny went to bed. All seemed safe. But around 1 a.m., Jenny awoke to the sound of something hitting the roof, a dull, heavy thud, followed by a rolling noise. She listened for a moment, but all went quiet again. 30 minutes later, smoke filled the hallway. The house was on fire. Jenny woke George, and together they began rousing the children. In the chaos, 4 of the children escaped with their parents. But 5 were unaccounted for. Maurice, 14, Martha, 12, Louis, 10, Jenny, 8, and Betty, 5. George tried desperately to reach them. He smashed a window, slicing his arm, and tried to re-enter the house. The staircase was already engulfed in flames. He ran outside to grab a ladder, but the ladder that always stood by the side of the house was gone. He then tried to move one of his coal trucks to climb up to a window. Neither of the trucks would start, even though they had worked earlier that day. A neighbor tried calling the fire department, but couldn't get through. Another drove into town to alert them in person. Because the town had no formal alert system, the firefighters did not arrive until nearly 8 hours later. By then, the house was a smouldering ruin. The sodders waited anxiously as the ashes were sifted, but no remains were found. Not a single bone, not a scrap of clothing, not even teeth. The fire chief told the family that the blaze had been hot enough to cremate the children entirely. But experts later disputed that. House fires rarely reach temperatures needed to fully destroy human bones, especially within a few hours. George and Jenny refused to believe their children had died in the fire. Then the oddities began to multiply. Neighbors reported seeing a man stealing a block and tackle, part of George's coal trucks, around the time of the fire. Others said they'd seen strange vehicles parked along the road near the Sodder home. One woman claimed to have seen the missing children peering from a car window the next day. A local bus driver said he saw people throwing balls of fire at the Sodder home shortly before the fire began, possibly Molotov cocktails. George later found a small, hard object in the yard, a green, pineapple-sized casing that looked like a type of incendiary device. Years passed, and the family never stopped searching. In 1949, they hired a pathologist to excavate the site. He found a few human vertebrae, but they were determined to belong to someone over 20 years old, too old to be one of the missing children, and showed no signs of fire damage. Stranger still, the bones had likely been placed there after the fire. In 1952, the Sodders erected a billboard along Route 16 with photos of the children and a plea for information. It stayed up for decades and became a local landmark. Tips trickled in for years. One woman claimed she saw Martha in a convent in St. Louis. A patron at a hotel in Charleston said they overheard 2 people speaking about a fire in Fayetteville, whispering, "The children survived." Another person mailed a photo to the Sodders. It showed a young man who looked like Louis Sodder at age 30. The back of the photo was inscribed with strange writing and a location: "I love Brother Frankie, Eliel Boys, A90132 or 35. The Sodders hired private investigators and even traveled across the country chasing leads, but nothing ever led to their children. Some believe the Sodder children were kidnapped. George Sodder had been born in Italy and was outspoken in his criticism of Mussolini. He had once argued with a man who warned him that his house would go up in smoke and the children would be destroyed. Could the fire have been revenge? Could someone have abducted the children in the confusion, planning the fire as a cover? Or did they die in the blaze, and the lack of remains was simply a tragic anomaly? No one knows. Jenny wore black for the rest of her life. George kept the billboard up until his death. The remaining Sodder children continued to search and question well into their old age. To this day, the disappearance of the Sodder children is one of the most enduring and heartbreaking mysteries in American history. A fire consumed the house, but it never silenced the questions. Case 10. The Tamam Shud case. The beach at Somerton, just south of Adelaide, Australia, was peaceful on the morning of December 1st, 1948. The sun was rising over the sea, casting pale orange light across the sand. Among the early walkers and beachgoers, someone noticed a man lying near the sea wall, slumped on the sand, neatly dressed in a suit. He looked as though he was sleeping, but when police arrived, they quickly determined the man was dead. He had no identification, no wallet, and no visible injuries. His arms were placed at his sides, his legs crossed neatly at the ankles. His pockets contained a half-used pack of chewing gum, a pack of Army Club cigarettes with 7 different brand cigarettes inside, a used bus ticket, and a train ticket. There were no signs of violence, no bruising, no blood. An autopsy revealed something stranger. His organs were congested with blood, suggesting possible poisoning, but no poison could be identified. In fact, his cause of death could not be determined at all. The body's condition suggested he had died while lying in that exact position. Calm, deliberate, posed. He was clean-shaven, well-built, with strangely muscular calves, perhaps a dancer, or someone who spent time in high-tension legwork. His suit had all identifying tags removed. No one came forward to identify him. Police photographed the body and sent his fingerprints across the world. Nothing matched. They printed newspaper stories, hoping someone would recognize him. No one did. Then came the suitcase. Several days later, investigators discovered a suitcase at the Adelaide railway station that had been checked into the cloakroom on November 30th, the day before the body was found. The items inside were odd: a stenciling brush, a pair of scissors cut down in a strange way, a screwdriver, a shaving kit, clothing with labels removed, and a spool of orange thread, the same unusual thread used to mend a tear in the man's trousers. Still, no identifying documents. Then came the most chilling discovery. Months later, a pathologist re-examined the body and found a small hidden pocket sewn into the man's waistband. Inside was a rolled piece of paper. It contained 2 words printed in ornate script, Tamam Shud. The phrase was identified as Persian. It means ended or finished. The words appear on the final page of a 12th century book of poetry, the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. This small clue opened the door to the case's strangest turn. A man came forward and reported that someone had left a copy of the Rubaiyat in the back seat of his unlocked car, which had been parked near the beach around the time of the man's death. The final page, the one that would have contained the words Tamam Shud, had been torn out. The missing slip of paper found on the body matched the torn edge. Inside the book, police found more. Written faintly in the back cover were 5 lines of what appeared to be a code, a jumble of letters with no discernible meaning. Beneath that, a local phone number was penciled in. The number led to a young nurse named Jo Thompson, who lived near Somerton Beach. When police questioned her, she appeared disturbed upon seeing a plaster cast of the dead man's face, so disturbed, in fact, that she nearly fainted, but she denied knowing who he was. Jo admitted she once owned a copy of the Rubaiyat and had given it to a man named Alf Boxall during the war. At first, police thought the dead man must be Boxall, but Boxall was found alive with his own copy of the book, intact. So who was the man on the beach? Why had he carried a phrase meaning ended in his pocket? Was it a suicide, staged carefully with references to poetry and love lost? Was he murdered, and if so, why? For decades, speculation has swirled. Some believe he was a spy. His tools, his code, his strange movements all point toward espionage during the tense early years of the Cold War. Others believe he was a jilted lover connected to Jo Thompson through a long-forgotten wartime romance. In 2021, the body was exhumed using modern forensic techniques. By 2022, researchers claimed they had likely identified him as Carl Charles Webb, an electrical engineer and instrument maker born in Melbourne in 1905. His identity was determined through DNA analysis, a remarkable breakthrough after 70 years. And yet, even if the man's name is now known, the mystery remains. Why was he in Adelaide? What caused his death? What were the code-like letters in the book? Why were his clothes scrubbed of identity? And what was his connection to Joe Thompson? Even with a name, the case remains one of the most haunting unsolved puzzles of the 20th century. A man found alone on a beach, dressed for travel, holding a quiet message in his pocket. It is finished. Story 1. The Vanishing at Island Moor. Soft wind over stone cliffs. The island of Island Moor sits in the remote waters of the Outer Hebrides off the western coast of Scotland. Part of the small Flannan Isles, it is little more than a jagged outcrop of grass and stone, surrounded by an ever-hungry sea. The waves crash endlessly against its steep cliffs, and seabirds cry through the air like memories echoing from long ago. In the winter of 1900, the island was home only to a lighthouse and the 3 men assigned to tend it. Their names were Thomas Marshall, James Ducat, and Donald MacArthur. 3 keepers posted far from the mainland to maintain the light that warned ships away from the rocks. It was a place of wind and silence, of lanterns lit against the dark, distant gulls calling. There was no permanent settlement on Island Moor, only the lighthouse and its few outbuildings. When a relief ship arrived on December 26th after days of delay due to storms, the crew noticed something strange even before they stepped ashore. The lighthouse, so often a bright gleam against the horizon, was dark. The landing party approached cautiously, noting that the island's landing gear, ropes and pulley systems to help bring supplies ashore, had been oddly left unfastened. There was no sign of the 3 keepers. No movement at all. The front door to the lighthouse was unlocked. Inside, everything seemed oddly frozen. The table was set for a meal never eaten. A chair was overturned. One of the clocks had stopped. Faint ticking slowing down. All 3 men were gone. There was no sign of violence, no apparent struggle. One of the oilskin coats still hung on its peg, suggesting that at least one of the men had gone out into the storm in only his indoor clothes. The Lighthouse Journal, kept faithfully until mid-December, ended abruptly. The last entries were peculiar. They spoke of fierce winds and strange behavior. Keeper Thomas Marshall had written that James Ducat was unusually quiet, and that Donald MacArthur, known for his toughness, had been weeping. He described a powerful storm, unlike anything they had experienced before. Yet no storms were recorded in the surrounding region at that time. Wind rising, then fading into silence. The final entry read simply, "Storm ended. Sea calm. God is over all." And then, nothing. Search parties scoured the island. No bodies were found. No sign of a fall from the cliffs. The island is small, and even the caves along the base were explored. There were only a few plausible explanations, each stranger than the last. Some suggested a wave, a monstrous one, had swept 2 of the men out to sea, and the 3rd had rushed out to help, only to be taken himself. But the idea that they'd all be outside in the storm, abandoning the light, was against protocol. One keeper was always meant to stay behind, and no footprints were found in the sodden grass, even days later. Faint creaking of wood and stone. Other theories were more supernatural, that the men were claimed by the island itself, by ancient forces that lingered among its stones. Folklore in the Hebrides spoke of strange voices on the wind, of watchers in the mist. The Flannan Isles, in particular, were once considered sacred and cursed. Locals would never spend the night there, not in older times. Even shepherds left the island before dusk. One sailor from the relief crew claimed he heard whispers around the cliffs, though he was alone. Just the wind, others said, but he was sure. It wasn't the wind. It was chanting. Soft, whispering wind layered with low voices. In the years that followed, the mystery of the Flannan Isles deepened. No trace of the men ever surfaced. No wreckage, no bodies. The lighthouse was later automated. But even now, sailors report uneasy feelings when passing near the island. Some say they see movement near the tower, figures standing still against the sky. Just shadows, maybe, or maybe something more. The sea keeps its secrets, and I learn more beneath the endless sweep of grey clouds and gulls remains quiet, always waiting, faint ocean swell ebbing. The next case takes us to another place and another time. Story 2. The Sleepwalker of Silver Plume, crackling fire, distant snowfall. Nestled high in the Rocky Mountains of Colorado, the town of Silver Plume seems to belong to another century. Once a silver mining boomtown, it now rests in sleepy silence, its population fewer than 200. The wooden buildings lean gently in the wind, as if listening to the mountains whisper. Time moves slowly here. In 1987, a young man named Tom Young arrived in town. He was quiet, bookish, and kind. The type of person who always said thank you, who greeted dogs as warmly as people. He opened a small bookstore on the main street, and for nearly a year he lived a quiet, peaceful life. Locals remembered him as thoughtful, sometimes melancholy. He often walked in the evenings alone through the pine forests that flanked the town. Then one day he vanished, faint crunching of snow underfoot. His dog Gus was gone too. There were no signs of struggle. His car was still in the garage, no note, no clue. Just absence. A room left undisturbed. Books half-stacked, as if he'd meant to return. The town searched. Volunteers combed the woods, but nothing was found. 9 months later, hikers discovered his remains deep in the forest. They found his backpack, a flashlight with dead batteries, and his dog still beside him. There was no trauma, no broken bones, just a sleeping bag, a peaceful posture, like he had gone to sleep and never awakened. A hunting rifle lay nearby, unused, soft forest wind rustling trees. The story might have ended there. A tragic mystery, a quiet death in the mountains. But it didn't, because 18 months after Tom disappeared, a journalist named Keith Reinhard came to Silver Plume, looking for a fresh start. A former sports writer from Chicago, Keith was tall, charming, curious. He rented the same shop that Tom had once owned, and he became fascinated with Tom's story. Too fascinated. He began interviewing locals, digging through old papers. He told friends he was writing a novel, a fictionalized account of Tom's disappearance. But he became increasingly convinced that the truth was stranger. That something, or someone, had lured Tom into the forest. Then, one warm August afternoon, Keith set off for a hike. He told his wife he'd be back by sunset. He never returned. Low mountain wind, steady and still. A massive search followed. Over 125 people scoured the terrain. Helicopters flew overhead. Dogs were brought in. Nothing. Not a single clue. Rescue teams were baffled. The terrain was steep, yes, but manageable. Keith was in decent shape. And he had taken no supplies. Not even a jacket. Just like Tom. As if he hadn't meant to disappear, but had. Locals began to whisper that something strange lingered in the mountains, a kind of echo, that Silver Plume pulled certain souls inward and never let them go. Some pointed out the eerie symmetry. 2 men, same age, same town, same shop, same end. Faint wind through pine needles. Others said Keith had become obsessed, that he'd wandered too far, searching for answers. But one searcher, a park ranger, said something else. He remembered seeing something, just for a moment. A figure on the ridge, watching them. Too far away to be clear. Still as stone. When he looked back again, it was gone. Of course, it could have been a trick of the light. The mountains do that. They play with the eyes. Or maybe it was someone who'd never left. The mystery of Silver Plume remains. The bookstore is long closed. Snow gathers on the windowsills. And now, when the wind is just right, some say they can hear footsteps echoing through the trees. Always walking, soft snow begins to fall. The next case takes us far north, where the nights grow long and the stars seem closer than the ground. Story 3, the lights over Langikuni, crackling ice, distant owl. In the vast northern reaches of Canada, tucked between frozen rivers and endless pine, lies Lake Unjikuni, a deep and quiet body of water in the Kivalliq region of Nunavut. Today, it's seldom visited, surrounded by snowy silence, but in the 1930s it was home to a small Inuit village, a place of warmth despite the cold. Fires burned in low stone homes. Laughter rose with the steam of cooking pots. Children played in the snow while hunters returned with caribou and fish. Then, one November night, everything changed. Joe LaBelle, a fur trapper familiar with the region, arrived near the village after a long trek. He expected to be welcomed with food and stories, as he had been before. But as he approached, something was wrong. Footsteps crunching on frozen ground. There was no sound, no voices, no dogs, no movement. He entered the village slowly, calling out. Nothing. Every home was empty, but nothing looked disturbed. Pots still simmered gently. Furs hung by the fire. Food remained half-prepared. Guns were in place. Boots lined up by doorways. Even the dogs, usually so energetic, were found dead, still tethered to posts, as if they'd simply stopped. There were no footprints leading away from the village, only the untouched snow, soft wind across open tundra. Joe was unnerved. He made his way quickly to the nearest telegraph station miles away to alert the authorities. When investigators arrived, they confirmed the bizarre scene. Not a single soul remained. No struggle, no disease, just absence. And above the lake that night, others reported strange lights. Bright, shimmering orbs that moved slowly across the sky. Not meteors, not stars. Something else. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police opened an investigation, but nothing was ever found. Over time, the story was dismissed, called folklore, an exaggeration. But those who visit the lake in winter speak quietly of what they see there, of moments when the snow hushes even the wind, when the air feels too still. And strange patterns appear along the ice, circles not formed by boots or animals, but smooth, geometric. Low pulsing hum, distant. Elders in nearby communities whisper that the people of Anjikuni were taken, not by violence, but by something older, something that travels with the stars, not lost, not dead, just elsewhere. And in that quiet part of the north, under green lights that dance across the sky, the silence of the vanished lingers. You can almost hear it between the owls and the snow. Aurora wins slowly. The night holds its mysteries, and now you may rest.
Case 1. The Vanishing of Louis Laprince. The late afternoon sun filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the cobblestone streets of Dijon, France. The year was 1890, and the air still carried the scent of autumn, crisp and dry, with a whisper of the distant countryside. A train sat idling at the station, a thin plume of smoke curling into the sky. Among its passengers was a man whose name few would recognize in modern times, though his legacy should have been one of fame and brilliance. Louis Laprince, an inventor and artist, had boarded the train that day bound for Paris. He was scheduled to travel onward to England, where he planned to showcase a device he had spent years perfecting, an early motion picture camera. Had he succeeded, his name might have become as familiar as Edison or Lumiere. But instead, Louis Laprince was never seen again. Witnesses last recalled seeing him wave gently from his train compartment, his belongings neatly packed, his demeanor calm. Yet when the train arrived in Paris, Laprince was nowhere to be found. Neither his luggage nor his body was ever located. There had been no sign of struggle, no reports of altercation, no evidence of a crime. The Laprince family was devastated. They searched tirelessly. Letters were sent, newspaper notices posted, and investigators hired. Every potential lead ended in a fog of uncertainty. Some speculated he had fallen victim to foul play, perhaps at the hands of rivals in the burgeoning field of motion picture technology. Others believed he may have disappeared of his own volition, perhaps overwhelmed by financial pressures or personal woes. Yet those who knew him best described a man filled with hope and anticipation for his upcoming demonstration in England. Among the theories that surfaced over the years, one peculiar detail captured the imaginations of amateur sleuths and dreamers alike. It was said that shortly before his disappearance, Laprince had confided in a colleague about a dream he'd had. In it, he stood before a crowd, his invention humming softly behind him as light flickered across a screen, breathing movement into stillness. But then the dream shifted. The faces in the crowd blurred and vanished. The machine slowed, and Le Prince himself began to fade, like a figure painted in smoke. He had laughed about it, brushing it off, but the dream lingered in his thoughts. Years later, in an archive long forgotten beneath dust and time, a single frame of Le Prince's original footage was discovered. A man mid-stride, walking through a garden, blurred, almost ghostly, a whisper of a moment, preserved in motion. And so, the mystery of Louis Le Prince endures, wrapped in silence and speculation. A man poised to shape the future, lost without a trace in the folds of history. Soft train whistle in distance. The next case takes us to a remote village in the Scottish Highlands, where the wind tells stories that the earth has long tried to forget. Case 2. The Flannan Isles Lighthouse Mystery. The sea was a shade of deep slate gray, churning softly beneath the weight of passing clouds. Off the western coast of Scotland, the Flannan Isles sat alone, windswept and ancient. These rocky outcrops had long been considered otherworldly, their jagged cliffs and wild grasslands steeped in folklore. In December of 1900, 3 lighthouse keepers were stationed on Elian Moor, the largest of the Flannan Isles. Thomas Marshall, James Ducat, and Donald MacArthur were charged with maintaining the lighthouse, ensuring its great lantern cut through even the darkest of storms. On the morning of December 26th, the supply ship Hesperus arrived, delayed by rough seas. As it approached, something seemed off. The lighthouse stood silent. No flag waved, no one came to greet the vessel. The air was oddly still. Captain Jim Harvey sent a man ashore. What he found was unsettling. The gate was closed, the path to the lighthouse unusually tidy. Inside, the kitchen table was set for a meal that had never been eaten. A chair was overturned. A clock had stopped. The light mechanism had not been wound. And the men, all 3, were gone. A logbook, its entries calm at first, soon veered into unease. One mentioned a powerful storm, though records showed clear skies during that time. Another described strange behavior, that one of the men had been weeping, another had grown silent and withdrawn. The final entry simply read, "Storm ended, sea calm, God is over all." Search efforts yielded nothing. The men had vanished, leaving behind only unanswered questions. Their oilskins were missing, suggesting they had gone outside. But the weather had been clear. There were no bodies, no footprints, no signs of struggle. Legends sprang forth. Some claimed the men had been taken by a rogue wave. Others whispered of sea spirits drawn to the light. One tale spoke of a great bird, cloaked in fog, that carried men away in silence. But perhaps most haunting were the dreams reported by villagers on the mainland in the days leading up to the discovery. They spoke of flickering lights, distant calls, and shadowy figures standing just beyond the threshold of sleep. The Flannan Isles lighthouse was automated years later, its rooms now empty. But sailors still glance at its beam as they pass, and locals tell their children to listen carefully on stormy nights. Sometimes, if the wind is just right, they say you can hear voices in the mist. Faint wind howling. Our final story drifts across the Atlantic to the Appalachian Mountains, where the woods breathe with ancient secrets. Case 3. The disappearance of Dennis Martin. The woods of the Great Smoky Mountains stretch vast and deep, cloaked in a soft, perpetual green. Mist hangs low in the mornings, curling through the branches like old spirits moving silently among the trees. These forests have watched generations pass, holding their memories in the rustle of leaves and the hush of running water. In June of 1969, the Martin family was camping near Spence Field, a wide and grassy clearing high in the Appalachians. They had hiked in, excited for a weekend in the wilderness. Dennis Martin, a bright and energetic 6-year-old, was with them, along with his older brother, father, and grandfather. On the afternoon of June 14th, as the sun filtered warmly through the canopy, the boys decided to play a light-hearted prank. They would split up, sneak around the adults, and jump out to surprise them. Dennis, wearing a red shirt, darted into the woods with a laugh. He was never seen again. The search began almost immediately. Within hours, park rangers, volunteers, and military personnel were combing the area. Dogs were brought in. Helicopters flew overhead. Night after night, voices called out through the dark. But the forest gave nothing back. No footprints, no scraps of clothing, no signs of struggle or distress, just silence. Stories emerged, as they always do in the face of mystery. One family, hiking nearby, claimed to have heard a scream, sharp, brief, and quickly silenced. They also reported seeing a strange, rough-looking man moving through the trees, carrying something over his shoulder. But their account was never verified. As the weeks turned to months, theories grew. Some believed Dennis had become lost and succumbed to the elements. Others suggested he had been taken. A few turned to the old tales of the Smokies, of creatures and watchers in the woods, remnants of a time before memory. Among local Cherokee legends, there are stories of beings known as Sul-Kalu, or the slant-eyed giants, who live in hidden places and occasionally cross paths with the world of men. Some believe these tales hold echoes of truth, but perhaps the most haunting aspect of Dennis Martin's case is the absence of finality. His family never gave up hope. Every year, on the anniversary of his disappearance, his father would return to the forest, walking the trails in quiet contemplation. Some nights, hikers have reported dreams while sleeping near Spence Field, dreams of a child's laughter in the distance, of red fabric caught on a branch, of footsteps just beyond the tent wall. The mountains hold their secrets close. They do not explain. They do not forget. Soft forest breeze. The night holds its mysteries, and now you may rest.